The warriors of Tsushima had spent their lives believing they understood the rules of battle. Their world was shaped by rituals, by the whistle of signaling arrows, by champions riding out alone to announce their lineage before blades were crossed. But when the foreign ships appeared on the horizon like drifting mountains of black wood, everything they knew began to crumble. The invaders who came ashore that morning fought with a discipline and cold precision that felt utterly alien. They formed themselves into tightly packed ranks, shields locked together like a moving wall, and advanced to the thunder of enormous drums that shook the ground beneath the hooves of the samurai horses. There was no time given for ritual or honor. There was only the steady march of a machine built for conquest. The defenders rode forward with fierce resolve, expecting duels, expecting a clash of equals, but the sky suddenly erupted with sounds they had never heard. Strange, hollow spheres arced through the air and exploded among them in burning flashes that hurled men and horses off their feet. Shrapnel sliced through armor, and thick smoke curled along the battlefield as warriors staggered in confusion. These devices, later called tetsuho, shattered not only formations but also belief. Every explosion tore another hole in the confidence of men raised on traditions unsuited for this kind of war. And as the blasts echoed across the beach, a storm of arrows followed, falling from Mongol composite bows that could fire farther and flatter than anything the samurai carried. Sukan, the island's commander, tried to rally his 80 riders, urging them to carve into the enemy line with the courage their ancestors would expect. They charged with a ferocity born of desperation, swords flashing in the smoky haze, but every push forward met the same unyielding wall. The Mongols did not break to accommodate samurai valor. They closed ranks, stepped in perfect coordination, and answered every act of bravery with overwhelming force. Each samurai who fell opened a hole that could not be filled. Each Mongol who dropped was instantly replaced by another soldier pressing forward without hesitation. By the time the sun began to sink, the battlefield was a wasteland of splintered arrows, broken armor, and bodies lying still beneath the drifting smoke. The defenders of Tsushima had fought with the full measure of their spirit, but spirit alone could not overcome an army trained to move as one. When the last pockets of resistance were crushed, the invaders spread across the island like a storm that had no mercy left to offer. Villages were burned, survivors hunted down, and warnings silenced before they could escape. Yet a few desperate fishermen managed to slip their boats into the dark waters, rowing with every ounce of strength they possessed toward the mainland. They carried news so grim it would ripple through every village and stronghold of Kyushu. Japan had never witnessed a threat like this before. And as word of Tsushima's destruction reached the shore, fear began spreading faster than the wind. The people understood now that the storm gathering across the sea was real, and it had already wiped out the first line of defense with terrifying ease. The news from Tsushima struck Iki Island like a hammer blow. Fishermen who made landfall at dawn brought stories of fire, shattered armor, and an enemy that fought like a single living beast instead of scattered warriors. Governor Tera no Kagetaka, a seasoned fighter who understood both duty and inevitability, listened in grim silence. He commanded barely 100 samurai, men loyal enough to follow him into any storm but far too few to stop one. Still, he sent an urgent plea south toward Dazaifu, hoping reinforcements might arrive before the world around them collapsed. Deep down, he knew they would not. The sea that separated them from salvation was too wide, and the invaders moved too fast. Panic spread across Iki as families abandoned their nets and fields, gathering what little they could carry while scanning the horizon for the dreaded black silhouettes of foreign ships. But beneath the fear, something harder began to take root. These were islanders whose lives were shaped by the tides, people who had endured storms, famine, and isolation for generations. If the Mongols were coming, then they would stand with their samurai instead of fleeing into hopelessness. So when the first clusters of enemy ships appeared 9 days after Tsushima's fall, the people of Iki did not scatter. They tightened their grips on improvised weapons, looked to Kagetaka, and prepared themselves for whatever was coming ashore. The landing began with chilling precision. Mongol craft slid toward the beaches in orderly waves, soldiers disembarking behind their shield walls as if performing a carefully rehearsed drill. Kagetaka, knowing open terrain offered his only chance, led his small band of samurai in a fierce charge. Their horses thundered across the sand, and the cries of the warriors rose into the morning air as they sought to meet the enemy with the same honor that had guided their ancestors. But once again, the clash that followed was not the duel of champions the samurai expected. Instead, a curtain of arrows and explosive projectiles tore into them before they could even reach the Mongol ranks. The foreign soldiers met the charge with an unbroken line of shields, pushing forward as a single unit. The few samurai who managed to close the distance crashed into spear points or were surrounded in seconds. Courage flickered like sparks, but the sparks were quickly smothered by sheer numbers and disciplined formations that moved with mechanical efficiency. Kagetaka watched as his riders fell one after another, realizing that another stand like this would only waste what little strength remained. With a heavy heart but unwavering resolve, he ordered a retreat toward Hinatori Castle, a modest wooden fortification that stood as the island's last refuge. Farmers, fishermen, and families fled there too, drawn more by desperation than hope. Behind them, the Mongols moved steadily inland, crossing fields and burning homes without slowing their advance. By dusk, the defenders had pulled back behind the earthen walls, the gates closed, and the torches lit. Outside, the invaders halted and withdrew to their ships, preparing for the next day's assault. Inside the fort, fear settled like a weight across every shoulder. Fathers told stories to their children to quiet trembling hands. The wounded gritted their teeth against pain. Kagetaka stood above them all, knowing that dawn would bring an attack they could not withstand. Yet he also knew that their stand on Iki Island would echo across Japan. Whatever happened at Hinatori Castle, their resistance had bought the mainland time, and time, in warfare, was as valuable as any blade. As the night deepened, the defenders tried to rest, but sleep would not come easily. The sea outside whispered, the fires crackled, and every mind clung to the knowledge that when the sun rose again, the Mongols would return with the full force of their terrifying new way of war. Dawn arrived with a heavy stillness, broken only by the distant churn of oars and the low rumble of foreign drums rolling across the water. When the defenders climbed to the wooden parapets of Hinatori Castle, the sight that met them froze even the bravest in place. The Mongol army encircled the fort completely, stretching in every direction like an unending tide of armor and banners. Their formations moved with calm purpose, adjusting lines, raising shields, preparing ladders, all while the drums pounded an unrelenting rhythm that pressed into the minds of everyone inside the walls. It was a sound that announced not only power but inevitability. The first shock of the assault arrived before any arrows were loosed in return. The invaders drove a line of captured Japanese prisoners to the front, forcing them forward at spear point toward the castle. The defenders stared in horror as familiar faces, neighbors, distant relatives, fishermen from nearby coves, stumbled into view, terrified and wounded. The Mongols meant to turn the defenders' compassion into a weapon. If the samurai fired, they would kill their own people. If they hesitated, the enemy would cross the killing ground unharmed. In that single moment, many archers felt their spirits falter, their hands shaking as they tried to decide whether honor demanded mercy or defense demanded ruthlessness. While hesitation rippled along the wall, the Mongols seized their advantage. A rain of arrows rose behind the line of prisoners and arced toward the fort, cutting through the air with chilling precision. The defenders ducked and scattered, wooden barriers offering little protection against the sheer volume of incoming fire. Some arrows struck the prisoners, others tore into the defenders, and soon the space between the armies was a chaotic blend of screams and dust. The psychological blow was as damaging as the physical one. The people inside Hinatori saw plainly that their enemy fought without the restraints or rituals they had always believed governed war. Moments later, the explosions began. Spherical iron and clay grenades sailed over the walls, landing among samurai and civilians alike before erupting in thunderous bursts. Splinters, stones, and metal fragments ripped through armor and flesh. Smoke filled the narrow walkways atop the walls, turning the morning light into a dull haze. The sound of each detonation shook the beams beneath the defenders' feet, and the screams of the injured mingled with the constant drumming from outside, creating a horrifying rhythm that seemed to swallow time itself. Despite the chaos, Kagetaka moved along the ramparts with the steadiness of a man who had already accepted his fate. His presence alone rallied pockets of defenders who steadied their bows and began firing back, aiming at the shadowy forms advancing behind the smoke. Every arrow they loosed was a reminder that they still lived, still resisted. When a section of the gate buckled under the pressure of Mongol battering rams, Kagetaka gathered his remaining mounted warriors and charged directly into the breach. Their sudden assault drove back the first wave of invaders, scattering them long enough to drag barricades into place and reinforce the entrance with whatever timber they could find. The momentary success breathed a flicker of life into the defenders, but it was a breath drawn against a rising tide. For every Mongol who fell, 2 more took his place. For every stretch of wall defended, another came under relentless assault. The defenders were running out of arrows, running out of strength, and running out of time. The smoke grew thicker, the heat from burning buildings intensified, and the cries of the wounded seemed to echo from every direction. Hours passed in a blur of movement and agony. By mid-afternoon, most of the walls had been breached in multiple places. Kagetaka stood soaked in sweat and blood, watching men he had trained fall beside him. He understood that the next charge through the gate would finish them. The castle was collapsing, its defense breaking apart like old wood under too much weight. Yet one truth remained unchanged: the way they chose to meet the end still belonged to them. And with that understanding settling heavily in his chest, Kagetaka prepared for a final decision that only a samurai lord could make. The afternoon sky dimmed beneath rising smoke, and the air inside Hinatori Castle grew thick with ash and the scent of burning timber. Every corridor echoed with the clash of steel and the agonized cries of the fallen. Kagetaka moved through the chaos with the slow, deliberate calm of a man who had already crossed the threshold between life and death. Around him, the final defenders clung to what remained of the fort, their armor cracked, their faces smeared with blood and soot. They had fought through exhaustion, fear, and wounds that would have felled most men long before, yet their resolve had not broken. Still, Kagetaka could see the truth in their eyes. There were too few left, and the Mongols were tightening their grip with every passing moment. When the next gate finally gave way under the relentless pounding of enemy rams, a fresh wave of foreign soldiers surged forward. The defenders braced themselves for impact, but Kagetaka stepped to the front, lifting his sword in a gesture that drew what remained of his warriors toward him. Perhaps only 36 still stood beside him, men who had followed him through every hopeless charge that day. They gathered in a tight knot at his back as the Mongol ranks closed in. Smoke curled around them, and the flames from nearby buildings cast their shadows against the ground like flickering spirits preparing to depart. Kagetaka knew that this last stand could not change the outcome, but he also knew that retreating into fire and ruin without a final cry of defiance would betray everything they believed. Honor was all that remained to give, and he would not let it fall untouched. Raising his voice above the thunder of drums and crackling flames, he called his warriors to charge. Their shout rose from their throats like a single, ragged roar as they stormed out through the broken gate and into the furnace of battle waiting beyond. The Mongols met them with shields and spears, but the small band of samurai sliced into their front lines with a ferocity born not of hope, but of pure conviction. They fought shoulder to shoulder, blades carving arcs of steel through the smoke, each step forward earned with sweat and blood. Kagetaka's presence burned brightest among them. His sword struck with the precision of a seasoned warrior who had accepted that each heartbeat might be his last. For a few brief moments, the Mongol advance faltered under the force of this unexpected surge. But numbers ruled the day. The defenders were surrounded, pressed from every direction as enemy soldiers closed in like tightening jaws. One by one, Kagetaka's men fell, overwhelmed by the tide. Yet the samurai lord fought on, even as wounds opened across his arms and legs, even as the world around him dissolved into fire and shadow. When the moment finally came that he could no longer push through the enemy ranks, he cut down the last man before him and staggered back toward the flaming keep of the castle. Inside the burning structure, the remaining civilians and retainers gathered with quiet resignation. The fires roared along the wooden beams overhead, sparks drifting down like molten snow. Kagetaka looked upon the faces of his family and loyal servants, his heart splitting with the weight of what must come next. Capture would mean humiliation, torture, and the possibility that secrets might be forced from them. That fate was unacceptable. In their final hour, there was still one choice left, the choice to preserve dignity when all else was lost. He ordered his daughter to be escorted away in the only small boat left on the shore behind the keep. The loyal retainer who carried out the command fled into the night as flames rose behind them. Kagetaka watched her departure for a fleeting moment of hope, a father's wish that at least one part of his legacy might survive the storm. Then he turned back to his people, understanding the path they all shared. As the castle's main hall roared with fire, Kagetaka and those closest to him performed their final act. The flames swallowed the keep, rising skyward like a beacon of defiance. Outside, Mongol soldiers stood watching as the last fortress on Iki Island collapsed into blazing ruin. The retainer who escaped by boat looked back only once, and in that moment, the last sight he saw was the silhouette of his lord disappearing into the fire, choosing a death on his own terms rather than surrender. Before dawn, the boat reached Hakata Bay. The retainer, trembling and half-blinded by smoke, brought the terrible news that Iki had fallen, that Kagetaka and his defenders were gone, and that the Mongol tide was now rolling toward the very heart of Japan. The fall of Iki Island sent ripples of dread across Kyushu, but the warning purchased with so much blood did not go unheeded. By the time the Mongol fleet advanced toward Hakata Bay on November 19th, the shoreline bristled with warriors drawn from every nearby province. These samurai understood the stakes more clearly than anyone before them. If Hakata fell, the way to Dazaifu, the political heart of Western Japan, would lie open, and the rest of the nation would be exposed to the same horrors that consumed Tsushima and Iki. The defenders knew they were outnumbered, but they also understood that this was the moment when every sword would shape the fate of the homeland. When the Mongol ships anchored offshore, the enemy's methodical preparation was unmistakable. Soldiers disembarked in disciplined waves, advancing behind walls of shields as drums thundered across the bay. Explosive bombs burst along the beach, scattering defenders and shaking the ground beneath them. Arrows darkened the sky, raining down in a rhythm so constant it seemed to swallow all other sound. Yet the samurai did not retreat. They pushed back with raw determination, fighting from ridge to shore with a ferocity fueled by memory. Memory of fallen comrades, of slaughtered villages, of a world that was now depending on their resolve. For an entire day, the beach became a battleground of clashing armor, burning debris, and cries that echoed above the roar of the sea. The Mongols steadily forced the defenders to yield ground, but the samurai refused to break. Even when gaps opened in their lines, fresh warriors surged in to close them. As dusk fell, the invaders seemed poised to deliver a decisive second strike at dawn. But then, in a move that puzzled every observer on shore, the foreign forces began to withdraw back to their ships. Perhaps they needed to regroup or resupply, or perhaps they underestimated the will of the defenders. Whatever the reason, the Mongols retreated into the night, leaving the battered samurai standing amid the wreckage and waiting for the next blow. That blow never came. Instead, the sky began to churn. Before midnight, winds gathered far out at sea, swelling into a storm so fierce that the shoreline itself trembled. By the time the first light of morning appeared, the bay was a chaos of towering waves and twisting gusts. The Mongol armada, anchored in open water, could do nothing to escape the wrath of nature. Ships collided and splintered as the storm intensified. Masts snapped like reeds, hulls shattered against each other, and men were cast into the raging sea by the thousands. When daylight fully broke across Hakata Bay, the samurai stood upon the cliffs and saw a graveyard of wreckage stretching across the water. More than 200 ships had been destroyed. Tens of thousands of soldiers would never return home. The invasion had been crushed, not by steel or strategy, but by the enormous force of a storm that appeared at the moment of greatest need. The people named it Kamikaze, the divine wind, believing the heavens themselves had intervened to save their land. Songs were written, prayers were offered, and the story spread from village to village as a symbol of spiritual protection. Yet in the halls of power, another truth became clear. Kublai Khan's ambitions did not end with one disaster. The Mongol emperor, enraged by failure, began planning an even larger invasion, determined to bring Japan to its knees. For 7 years, Japan braced itself. Along Hakata Bay, engineers and laborers constructed a massive stone wall that stretched for miles, designed to prevent another landing. Blacksmiths studied shattered armor recovered from battlefields and redesigned weapons accordingly, forging stronger, wider blades that could withstand the crushing force of Mongol shields. The elegant tachi of earlier generations slowly gave way to sturdier designs that would one day evolve into the famed katana. Across the nation, fortifications strengthened, alliances formed, and the lessons of the first invasion reshaped the identity of the samurai class. When the Mongols returned in 1281 with a colossal armada, some sources claiming more than 4,000 ships and well over 100,000 men, the defenders were ready. The invaders seized Tsushima and Iki once again, but when they reached Hakata, the Great Wall prevented them from landing directly. Their forces became tangled in drawn-out fighting on offshore islands and at sea. For 2 grinding months, the Japanese held their ground, refusing to allow the enemy a foothold on the mainland. Then, as if history itself were repeating, the winds shifted once more. Another typhoon swept across the region with unimaginable force. Waves surged across decks, uprooting anchors and pulverizing ships against the rocks. Entire fleets were turned into splintered ruins in a single night. When the storm finally passed, the Mongol invasion was broken beyond repair. Those who survived fled across the open sea, and the dream of a Mongol-conquered Japan died amid the ruins of their shattered hulls. In the aftermath, a new sense of unity settled over Japan. The samurai saw themselves not only as warriors but as guardians of a land protected by divine will. The story of Taira no Kagetaka's last stand on Iki Island became a symbol of unwavering courage, retold through generations as an example of honor in the face of certain defeat. Centuries later, after the Meiji Restoration, Kagetaka was enshrined as a local deity, his memory preserved at a Shinto shrine on the very island where he made his final stand. In the modern era, the tale found new life through books, films, and even video games, most notably a depiction that brought global attention to the fierce battles on Tsushima and Iki. Though creative liberties were taken, the spirit remained true. The clash of cultures, the terror of Mongol warfare, the resilience of samurai defenders, and the haunting beauty of islands that became battlefields for the soul of a nation. The story of the samurai who stood against the greatest empire of their age still resonates. It is a reminder that empires can be challenged, that courage can echo across centuries, and that even in the darkest moments, hope may come from places no one expects. From the doomed charges on Iki to the storms that reshaped history, their legacy continues to inspire, proof that the human spirit can endure even when the world seems determined to crush it.